Letters to IDMR presents the forgotten co-founder, Carl F. Gross, and the shrouded origins of the Institute of Divine Metaphysical Research. Anonymous.
For years, I sat in the audience, listening to the teachings that shaped my life and the lives of so many others. The words of Henry Clifford Kinley were often spoken with such conviction that one couldn't help but be swept up in the fervor. But there was always another figure, one who stood in the background, seldom speaking, yet ever present, Carl F. Gross. Today, I feel compelled to share his story, a story that, like Carl himself, has been largely forgotten or purposefully obscured. The early years. Carl F. Gross was a German Jew whose origins were as enigmatic as his role in the Institute. He was one of Henry Kinley's first students, there in the beginning, in the early to mid-1930s. How a man of such background found his way into the teachings of a Midwestern spiritual leader is a question worth pondering. But it's one for which there are few clear answers. What is known is that Carl brought with him a quiet determination and, perhaps more importantly, a significant fortune. As the Institute of Divine Metaphysical Research began to take shape, Carl stood by Kinley's side, not as a visionary, but as a supporter, a co-founder, as Kinley would later title him. Unlike Kinley, who claimed to have received divine visions, Carl never made such claims. Instead, his contributions were far more grounded, yet equally vital. While Kinley captivated audiences with his interpretations of the Bible and metaphysical concepts, Carl was the one ensuring the light stayed on, that there was a roof over our heads. The quiet contributor. Carl's presence in the IDMR was a study in contrasts, not just in temperament, but in heritage as well. Carl F. Gross was a white man of German Jewish descent, while Henry Clifford Kinley was a Black and Native American mixed heritage. In the 1930s, such a partnership was highly unusual, especially in a spiritual movement that encouraged racial integration within its membership. This aspect of the IDMR drew significant criticism from outsiders, particularly in a society still deeply entrenched in racial segregation. Yet, within the walls of the Institute, these racial differences were downplayed, with a focus instead placed on the spiritual unity that Kinley preached. Despite his integral role, Carl remained a figure of relative obscurity. While Kinley's voice filled the room with impassioned teachings and visionary declarations, Carl's contributions were quiet, almost invisible. He would occasionally stand to speak, offering only a brief and enigmatic phrase, "Yahweh is all in all, and that's all," before returning to his seat. It was as if he was content to let his financial support speak for him, rather than seeking the spotlight. But Carl's impact was profound. He was the financial backbone of the IDMR, a fact that cannot be overstated. When the decision was made to relocate the organization to California in 1958, it was Carl's wealth, over $100,000, that made it possible.
$100,000 in 1958 would be like over $1 million in today's money.
He purchased the International House on West 21st Street in Los Angeles, securing a physical space for the movement's continued growth. For this, Kinley promised him, "There will always be a place for you here." However, as the years unfolded, it became clear that promises in the IDMR were often as transient as the visions that inspired them. The unseen president. Carl's tenure as the president of the IDMR was marked by an uneasy juxtaposition of title and influence. Though he held the title of president, it was Kinley who remained the face and voice of the organization. Carl, lacking the charisma and flair that defined Kinley's public persona, was overshadowed, his contributions largely unrecognized by the broader membership. However, there is an important and little-known fact that adds complexity to Carl's role within the IDMR. In the spring of 1971, when Dr. Kinley, the founder and dean, was ready to step down as dean, he first offered the deanship to Carl Gross. This gesture was a significant recognition of Carl's loyalty and contributions to the Institute. Yet, in a decision that might have changed the course of IDMR history, Carl turned down the offer. Perhaps Carl recognized his own limitations in filling the charismatic role that Kinley had played. Or perhaps he simply preferred to continue his work behind the scenes away from the limelight. Ultimately, Carl agreed with the choice of Robert Harris as Kinley's successor, but this decision may have planted the seeds of discord. It is not unreasonable to speculate that Harris's eventual resentment towards Carl could have been fueled by the knowledge that the deanship was first offered to Carl. Harris, despite his later ascension, might have harbored a deep-seated animosity, knowing that he was not Kinley's first choice. This could explain why Harris later encouraged members to view Carl not as a benefactor and co-founder, but as a negative spirit, an adversary to Kinley's divine mission. This rewriting of Carl's role in the IDMR's history served to further marginalize his contributions, casting him not as an asset to the organization's growth, but as an obstacle. What makes this narrative shift even more troubling is the realization that Carl had, in large part, funded the move to Los Angeles and continued providing financial support for years. His substantial contributions included not just the financing of the publishing of the first textbook, God the Archetype, in 1960 to 61, which was made possible by members who sold their homes to raise the necessary funds, but also helping Kinley write many passages. He also claimed to have ghost-authored pamphlets that were attributed to the founder. It is quite possible that Carl believed that by investing in the Institute, his was securing not just its future, but his own, with promises of a lifelong home in the apartments he had helped finance. Yet, by the time I met Carl in 1972, the wealth that had once underpinned the IDMR had been exhausted, leaving Carl and his wife Lena living off a modest pension and Social Security, by 1982, a total of only $500 a month. However, it is important to stress that Carl Gross never lost his official status. Despite the attempts to diminish his legacy, Carl was always recognized as CEO founder and, eventually, President Emeritus. This title of Emeritus was agreed upon by headquarters through tenuous negotiation, acknowledging his lifelong commitment to the Institute. Despite their best efforts, no one could ever strip him of his rightful place as co-founder, a title that signified his enduring importance to the IDMR's origins and development. The Betrayal. As the years passed, the seeds of Carl's tragic end were sown. Bishop Willie Jones, one of Kinley's students, had moved to the South, opening branches of the IDMR in Alabama and Georgia. But Jones had ambitions of his own, ambitions that would eventually lead to a split from the Institute and the formation of a rival organization, the Assembly of Divine Reality. In the power struggles that followed, Carl became a pawn. By the time Jones invited Carl to stay with him in the South, Carl was an old man, suffering from what seemed to be dementia or senility. Vulnerable and isolated, he was lured away from the very organization he had helped build. Meanwhile, back in California, Dr. Robert Harris, the Institute's vice president and esteemed medical doctor, saw an opportunity. With Carl away, Harris assumed control, running the international board meetings in Carl's absence. Dr. Gross didn't so much as darken the door for years, Harris would later say, justifying his takeover. The tragic end. Carl's story, like so many others in the IDMR, ended in heartbreak. After years in the South, he attempted to return to California, to the apartment he had purchased in the International House. But the welcome he expected was nowhere to be found. The apartment had been taken over, and when advocates reminded the Institute of Kinley's promise, they were met with cold indifference. He did have a place, but he gave it up, was the response. This version of events, however, is only part of the truth. Carl, in his declining years, had indeed requested that his belongings be shipped to him in the South, and had informed his friends that they could keep the rest. He had no intention of returning to California, but this decision was made under the weight of his deteriorating health and the hostile environment that had been created for him within the IDMR at Los Angeles. By the time he arrived in the South in 1982, Carl weighed only 118 pounds, was diabetic, and had no balance, living off baby formula. The man who had once funded the IDMR was now reduced to a state of frailty, his life sustained by the kindness of a few who still remembered his contributions. During his time in the South, Carl's health continued to decline, and despite the Institute's promises, he found no comfort or support from those in power. Messages from headquarters demanded his resignation, but Carl, ever faithful to Kinley's teachings, refused. He had been told that his position was for life, and he clung to that promise even as his mental faculties diminished. Eventually, Carl was sent to live with his daughter in California, though he didn't stay with her for long. He moved to his son's home in Springfield, but once again, the arrangement didn't last. In the end, Carl F. Gross, once the wealthy co-founder of the IDMR, died alone in a nursing home, a pauper, his contributions forgotten by the very institution he had helped to build. Conclusion. Carl F. Gross was a man who, in many ways, gave everything to the Institute of Divine Metaphysical Research. Yet, in the end, he was cast aside, his contributions minimized, his legacy forgotten. As a former member, I cannot help but reflect on the fairness of it all. Did Carl receive the recognition and respect he deserved? Was he treated fairly by the very people he had supported for so many years? And yet, no matter the efforts to rewrite his story, Carl Gross's place in the IDMR could never be entirely erased. He was, and always will be, the CEO founder of the Institute, a title that no one could take from him. Even as his role was diminished, he remained President Emeritus, a lasting testament to his lifelong dedication. Moreover, the fact that the deanship was first offered to Carl Gross in the spring of 1971 adds a hidden layer of complexity to the story. Was Harris's animosity towards Carl rooted in the knowledge that he had been the second choice? This question lingers, suggesting that the power struggles within the IDMR were not just about leadership, but also about deeply personal rivalries and insecurities. The story of Karl F. Gross is not just a footnote in the history of the IDMR. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of charismatic leadership, the fragility of promises, and the ease with which the contributions of those who prefer to work in the shadows can be forgotten. As we look back on the origins of the IDMR, let us remember Karl not just as a co-founder and president emeritus, but as the man whose quiet dedication made it all possible.
This is Karl F. Gross, a German Jew, standing in front of the home of Nidabel Cox, Dr. Kinley's sister. Dr. Gross was among the earliest students in the school, sometime around 1932, and was eventually named the co-founder and international president of the Institute.